My ex-husband crashed my daughter's funeral, demanding her $35 million inheritance. I watched him stride down that church aisle like he owned the place. 15 years of silence apparently meaning nothing when money was involved. The bastard actually had the nerve to sit in the front row next to me, whispering about our rights, while my Emma lay in her casket. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'm Margaret Sullivan, and this is how I learned that some people will crawl out from under any rock for the right price. Let me paint you the picture. There I was, 65 years old, burying the only person who ever truly mattered to me, when Rob Sullivan decides to make his grand entrance. 15 years. 15 years since he walked out on us, and suddenly he's back because Emma made something of herself without him. "Maggie," he whispered, sliding into the pew like nothing had happened. "We need to talk about Emma's estate." I turned to look at this man I'd once loved, this stranger who'd abandoned his 8-year-old daughter when things got tough. His hair was gray now, expensive suit perfectly tailored, manicured nails resting on his knee. Success looked good on him, which made me want to slap him even more. "We don't need to talk about anything, Rob," I said, keeping my voice low. "You gave up any rights to her when you disappeared." He leaned closer, and I could smell his cologne, still wearing that same brand he'd worn when we were married. Some things never change, I guess. She was my daughter too, Maggie. I have legal standing. Legal standing. He had legal standing while I had sleepless nights nursing Emma through fever dreams when she was 9. Legal standing while I worked 2 jobs to pay for her college applications. Legal standing while I held her hand through 6 months of chemotherapy, watching leukemia steal the light from her brilliant eyes. The pastor began the eulogy, talking about Emma's kindness, her intelligence, her incredible business success. 23 years old and worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. My baby girl, who'd started coding at 12 and built her first app at 16. Rob nodded along like he'd been there for any of it, like he'd earned the right to mourn. "She built that company thinking of you, you know," he whispered during the closing hymn. "Always wondered where her old man was." That's when I realized Rob Sullivan hadn't just shown up at our daughter's funeral. He'd come armed with lies, ready to rewrite history for his own benefit. But if he thought 15 years of abandonment had left me weak, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he could be. After the service, I watched him work the crowd, introducing himself to Emma's business partners and friends like the grieving father he'd never been. The performance was flawless, and I knew right then this was going to get ugly. Emma's story started when she was 19, sitting in our tiny apartment kitchen with a laptop older than some of her college classmates. "Mom," she'd said, looking up from lines of code I couldn't understand, "I think I figured out how to fix the problem nobody else can solve." She'd been obsessed with medical data security ever since I'd told her about the nightmare we'd faced when her father left. Hospitals losing patient records, insurance companies denying coverage because files went missing, people dying because their medical history disappeared into digital black holes. Emma took it personally. What if medical records could be completely secure but instantly accessible to any authorized person? "Anywhere in the world?" she'd asked, her eyes bright with possibility. "What if no one ever had to suffer because their information got lost or hacked?" I'd smiled and made her another cup of coffee, thinking it was a sweet dream. I was working as a hospital administrator then, seeing the same data problems she talked about every single day. The difference was, Emma believed she could fix them. 6 months later, she dropped out of college. I nearly had a heart attack. "Mom, I got into the tech accelerator program," she'd explained, practically bouncing with excitement. "They're giving me $50,000 and 3 months to build MedSecure. Real investors want to see what I can do." "Sweetheart, you're throwing away your education for what might be a pipe dream," I'd argued, terrified she was making the biggest mistake of her life. She'd looked at me with those serious green eyes she'd inherited from her grandmother. "Mom, what if it's not a pipe dream? What if this could help millions of people? What if I could make sure no family ever goes through what we went through?" That accelerator program changed everything. Emma didn't just build MedSecure, she revolutionized how medical data worked. By 21, hospitals across the country were implementing her system. By 22, international health organizations were paying millions for licenses. The day Forbes called her the medical data genius who could save lives, Emma had cried in my arms. Not from joy, but from exhaustion. Success was incredible, but it was also overwhelming for someone barely old enough to drink legally. "I did it for us, Mom," she'd whispered that night. "I wanted to prove that what happened to our family mattered, that we could turn Dad's abandonment into something that helped other people." $35 million. That's what MedSecure was worth when Emma got sick. $35 million that represented not just brilliant coding and business acumen, but every sacrifice we'd made, every night I'd worked late to pay for her computer classes, every moment she'd chosen to fight for something bigger than herself. Now Rob wanted his share, like he'd contributed anything beyond DNA and heartbreak. But what Rob didn't know was that Emma had been expecting this day long before she got sick. My brilliant daughter had seen him coming from a mile away. The day Rob left us, Emma had been building a blanket fort in our living room. 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. She'd invited me inside her fort for a tea party with her stuffed animals, using the good china I'd been saving for special occasions. "Daddy's been acting weird," she'd said, pouring imaginary tea for Mr. Buttons, her teddy bear. "He keeps looking at his phone and talking in whisper voices." I'd forced a smile, pretending everything was normal, even though I'd found the divorce papers Rob thought he'd hidden so well. "Sometimes grown-ups have big feelings, sweetheart. It doesn't mean anything's wrong." But everything was wrong. Rob had been having an affair with his secretary for 6 months. Classic, right? The cheating husband, the loyal wife who didn't see it coming, the innocent child caught in the crossfire. If it wasn't happening to me, I would have rolled my eyes at the cliché. "Maggie, we need to talk," he'd said when he got home that evening, his voice already distant, already gone. Emma had run to hug him like always, and I'd watched his face carefully. No guilt, no sadness, just impatience to get through an unpleasant task. That's when I knew our marriage wasn't ending, because he'd fallen out of love with me. It was ending because he'd never really loved either of us at all. "Emma, honey, go play in your room for a few minutes," I'd said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Daddy and I need to discuss some boring grown-up stuff." She'd skipped away, humming to herself, still living in a world where her parents worked things out and families stayed together. 5 minutes later, that world would be gone forever. "I'm leaving," Rob had said without preamble. No apology, no explanation of the affair, no acknowledgement of what this would do to Emma. "I've filed for divorce. I'll be out by the weekend." "What about Emma?" I'd asked, though I already knew the answer from his expression. "She'll be better off with you. Kids need stability, and Linda and I were planning to travel, build a life together. Emma would just complicate things." Complicate things. Our daughter, his flesh and blood, would complicate his new life. I'd wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand what he was destroying. Instead, I'd nodded quietly and started planning how to tell an 8-year-old that her daddy was choosing someone else over her. The weekend came and went. Rob packed his belongings with ruthless efficiency, kissed Emma's forehead like he was leaving for a business trip, and walked out of our lives without looking back. Emma had stood at the window for 3 hours that first night, convinced he'd forgotten something and would come back for it. "Maybe he'll remember Mr. Buttons," she'd whispered. "Daddy gave him to me for my birthday." But Rob never came back. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no Christmas presents. Complete radio silence while I worked 2 jobs, and Emma learned not to ask about her father anymore. 15 years later, here he was, perfectly groomed and legally prepared, ready to claim his share of the fortune Emma built while missing him every single day of her life. Some people have no shame, but then again, some people also have no idea what they're really up against. The morning after Emma's funeral, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like sadness when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Rob standing on my porch with a thin man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Lawyers. Of course. I took my time answering, finishing my coffee and checking my hair in the hallway mirror. Not because I cared how I looked to Rob, but because showing up looking like death would give him ammunition. I'd learned a long time ago that dignity was sometimes the only weapon you had. "Maggie," Rob said with his politician smile when I opened the door, "I'd like you to meet Thomas Mitchell, my attorney. We were hoping we could have a civilized conversation about Emma's estate." "How civilized can we be?" "Civilized." "Rob?" I asked, not inviting them in. You haven't spoken to Emma in 15 years, and now you want half her money? Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, all professional polish and legal intimidation. But something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with this case. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand this is an emotional time, but there are legitimate legal questions that need to be addressed. Mr. Sullivan maintains he has parental rights. Maintains? I repeated, catching the careful word choice. That's interesting phrasing for something that should be straightforward legal fact. Mitchell shifted slightly, and I caught Rob shooting him a warning look. The law regarding parental rights can be complex. We're here to discuss a reasonable settlement that avoids costly litigation. I stepped aside and let them into my living room, not because I wanted to, but because this conversation needed to happen somewhere private. Rob looked around at the modest furniture, the family photos covering every surface, the life he'd walked away from without a backward glance. You've kept it exactly the same, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. Even Emma's school pictures. Why would I change it? I asked. This was our home. Emma's and mine. The home you chose to leave. Thomas Mitchell opened his briefcase, but his movements seemed hesitant. Mrs. Sullivan, before we proceed, I need to ask, are you aware of any documentation regarding Mr. Sullivan's parental status? Any court orders or legal modifications? Rob's face went pale. Tom, we discussed this. My situation is complicated, but what kind of complications? I asked, sensing weakness. Mitchell looked between Rob and me, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Sullivan, I think you need to explain the situation fully. I can't represent you effectively without complete disclosure. What situation? I pressed. Rob's confidence was cracking. Maggie, there were some legal proceedings years ago. When you were trying to get child support, I had to make some difficult decisions. That's when the pieces started falling into place. The way Mitchell had phrased maintains he has rights instead of stating it as fact. The hesitation, the careful language, the obvious tension between lawyer and client. Rob, I said quietly, what exactly did you do to avoid paying child support? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My ex-husband hadn't just abandoned Emma emotionally. He'd done something legal, something permanent, something that was about to destroy his inheritance claims completely. And his own lawyer was beginning to realize he'd been lied to. I think, Thomas Mitchell said carefully, closing his briefcase, that I need to conduct some additional research before we proceed further. Mr. Sullivan, we should discuss this privately. Rob was sweating now, despite the cool morning air. Tom, I explained that the situation was complex. We can work around any complications. Can we? Mitchell asked pointedly. Because if there are existing court orders that terminate or modify your parental rights, that fundamentally changes the legal landscape. I watched this exchange with growing satisfaction. Rob had clearly misled his attorney about the extent of his legal problems, and now it was coming back to bite him. What court orders? I asked innocently, though I was beginning to suspect what Emma had discovered during her illness. Mitchell looked at Rob expectantly. When no answer came, he stood up. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to need you to provide me with complete copies of all legal proceedings related to your relationship with your daughter. All of them. After they left, with Mitchell looking increasingly unhappy and Rob desperately trying to maintain control of a crumbling situation, I sat back in my chair and thought about Emma's final months. She'd been so weak from chemotherapy, but there had been days when she'd rallied enough to work on her laptop. I'd assumed she was managing business affairs, but now I wondered if she'd been doing something else entirely. My daughter had always been thorough when it came to protecting the people she loved. The phone rang an hour later. Victoria Chen's name appeared on the caller ID. Margaret, I saw the news coverage of Emma's funeral, Victoria's familiar voice said. I'm so sorry for your loss. Emma was extraordinary. Victoria Chen had been Emma's mentor since the early days of MedSecure, not a business partner, but something almost as valuable. A successful entrepreneur who'd taken Emma under her wing and guided her through the complexities of building a tech company. Emma had talked about Victoria constantly, crediting her with much of MedSecure's strategic success. Thank you, Victoria. Emma always spoke so highly of you. Margaret, I'm calling because Emma asked me to reach out if certain situations arose after her death. She was concerned about potential complications regarding her estate. I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of complications? The kind involving absent fathers who might suddenly develop an interest in inheritance rights. Emma was quite thorough in her preparations. She asked me to coordinate with you if such a situation developed. Coordinate how? Victoria's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Emma left very specific instructions about protecting you and her legacy from opportunistic relatives. She anticipated that her father might emerge from whatever rock he'd been hiding under if her success became public knowledge. She prepared for this? Margaret. Your daughter spent the last year of her life building legal and strategic defenses against exactly this scenario. She had investigators, attorneys, and evidence. She knew her father better than he knew himself. I thought about Rob's sweating face, his nervous lawyer, the obvious gaps in his story.
Victoria, what exactly did Emma discover? Everything. And she made sure that if her father tried to claim inheritance rights, the full truth about his character would become public knowledge. Emma didn't just build a company, Margaret. She built a fortress around everyone she loved. That evening,
as I sat in Emma's old room looking through her papers, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was a letter in Emma's careful handwriting. Mom, if you're reading this, it means Dad showed up looking for money. Don't worry, I've handled everything. Trust Victoria, and remember, I love you more than all the money in the world. The next morning, Thomas Mitchell called with news that would change everything. Mrs. Sullivan, Thomas Mitchell's voice was tight with professional embarrassment, I need to inform you that I'm withdrawing as Mr. Sullivan's counsel. There are ethical issues that prevent me from continuing representation. What kind of ethical issues? I asked, though I could guess. Client confidentiality prevents me from discussing details, but I can say that Mr. Sullivan was not forthcoming about crucial aspects of his legal status regarding parental rights. After he hung up, I called Victoria Chen. Rob's lawyer just quit. What did Emma find? Victoria's laugh was sharp. Emma found that your ex-husband legally terminated his parental rights 11 years ago to avoid paying child support. He has zero legal claim to her estate. The timeline clicked into place. When Emma was 12, I'd hired a lawyer to pursue back child support. The case had mysteriously stalled, and I'd been told something about changed circumstances. I'd been too overwhelmed working 2 jobs to understand the legal complexities. He chose to legally abandon Emma to save himself $300 a month, Victoria continued. And now he wants to claim $35 million. The irony is breathtaking. Why didn't Emma tell me? She wanted to protect you from the pain, but she also wanted to be prepared if he ever tried to stake a claim on her success. That afternoon, Victoria arrived at my house with a detailed folder of documents. Emma's investigation had been thorough, but not the elaborate spy network I might have imagined. She'd hired a competent private investigator and worked with estate attorneys to document Rob's abandonment. Emma also discovered something else, Victoria said, showing me photographs and documents. Your ex-husband has a pattern of targeting women with resources and then abandoning them when the money runs out. The photos showed Rob with different women over the years since leaving us. After he left you, he lived with Carol Jenkins and her 4-year-old daughter Sarah for 3 years. When Carol's savings ran out, he disappeared. Then he married Linda Morrison for her inheritance money. But the most damaging revelation was yet to come. Emma tracked down Carol Jenkins 2 years ago. Carol's daughter Sarah is now 16, and she's been dealing with the same abandonment issues Emma faced. Victoria showed me correspondence between Emma and Carol. My daughter had been quietly helping Sarah Jenkins with college preparation and counseling, creating a support network for children abandoned by the same man. Emma prepared for the possibility that Rob would challenge her estate, Victoria explained. She documented his pattern of abandoning children, gathered evidence of financial exploitation, and created a comprehensive case that would destroy his credibility. The folder contained testimonies from Carol Jenkins about Rob's financial abuse, documentation of his terminated parental rights, and evidence of his current financial desperation.
Emma hadn't just protected her estate. She'd built a case that would expose Rob's true character if he dared to challenge her wishes. There's one more thing, Victoria said, pulling out a final document. Emma arranged for all of this information to be released to selected journalists if Rob pursued inheritance claims. She wanted his pattern of abandoning children to become public knowledge. That's when I understood the full scope of Emma's preparations. My daughter hadn't just anticipated Rob's greed. She'd created consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life if he tried to profit from abandoning her. The next morning, Rob called. His voice was desperate, all pretense of charm gone. But Emma's plan was already in motion, and there was no stopping what came next. "Maggie, we need to talk." Rob's voice cracked through the phone. "Things have gotten complicated. Linda found out about Emma. She's furious I didn't tell her I had a daughter." "Imagine that," I said dryly. "Your wife is upset you lied about having a child. How shocking. She's threatening to leave me. She says I deceived her about being childless. She's talking about lawyers, about our prenup being invalid because of misrepresentation." I could hear the panic in his voice. Rob's second marriage was falling apart. And from what Victoria had shown me, Linda Morrison's inheritance money was all that stood between Rob and complete financial ruin. "Rob, what do you want from me?" "I need Emma's inheritance more than ever. Linda's cutting me off financially. My construction business is bankrupt. I have nowhere else to turn." "You should have thought about that before you legally terminated your parental rights." The silence on the other end was deafening. Who told you about that?" "Emma knew, Rob. She's known for years. My daughter was brilliant, remember? Did you really think she wouldn't investigate the man who abandoned her?" That afternoon, Victoria and I met with Emma's estate attorney, David Washington. A thorough, careful man in his 50s, David had worked with Emma to create ironclad protections against exactly this situation. "Mrs. Sullivan," David explained, "Emma's estate planning is comprehensive. Your ex-husband's terminated parental rights make any inheritance claim legally impossible. But Emma went further than just legal protection. He showed us a timeline Emma had created, documenting Rob's pattern of financial exploitation. After leaving us, Rob had systematically drained Carol Jenkins's savings before abandoning her and her daughter. He'd married Linda Morrison primarily for her trust fund, which he'd been depleting through failed business ventures. Emma wanted his behavior documented not just for legal protection, but for the protection of future victims, David continued. "She believed men like your ex-husband continue their patterns until someone stops them. The plan Emma had created was elegant in its simplicity. If Rob pursued inheritance claims, the documentation of his abandoned children and financial exploitation would become public record through court filings. If he escalated with media attention or harassment, Emma had prepared even more devastating revelations. Emma also established a fund," Victoria added, "to help children abandoned by absent parents. She specifically wanted Sarah Jenkins and other victims of your ex-husband's abandonment to receive educational support." That evening, Carol Jenkins called me. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to thank you for what Emma did for Sarah. Your daughter reached out to us 2 years ago and has been helping with college preparation. I didn't know Emma had contacted you. She said she understood what Sarah was going through because she'd lived it herself. Emma helped Sarah get counseling and tutoring. She said girls who lose their fathers need other women to show them they're worth something." Talking to Carol was like looking into a mirror of my own experience. Rob had charmed his way into her life, played stepfather to her daughter, systematically depleted her resources, and then vanished when the money ran out. "The hardest part," Carol said, "was explaining to a 7-year-old why the man who'd been reading her bedtime stories suddenly didn't want to see her anymore. That night, I finally understood the full scope of Emma's legacy. She hadn't just built a successful company. She'd created a network of protection and support for people like us, the ones Rob Sullivan had used and discarded. And now, facing financial ruin and exposure, Rob was about to learn what it felt like to be abandoned by someone you thought you could count on." The news articles started appearing 3 days later, not through any elaborate media conspiracy Emma had arranged, but through simple public records requests that journalists made after Rob's bankruptcy filing mentioned potential inheritance disputes. "Construction company owner seeks inheritance from daughter he abandoned," appeared first in the local business journal. Then larger papers picked up the story. The terminated parental rights document became public record when Rob's new lawyer tried to file a challenge petition. Victoria showed me the coverage over coffee. Emma didn't have to orchestrate media attention. She just had to ensure that when Rob made his grab for money,
The truth about his character would be easily discoverable. My phone had been ringing all morning. Reporters wanted statements about Rob's claims. I'd declined interviews, but the story was growing on its own momentum. Rob Sullivan, the man who'd legally abandoned his 8-year-old daughter to avoid child support, was now seeking millions from her estate. Linda Morrison called me directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Linda Morrison. I believe you knew my husband before I met him." "Yes, Rob is my ex-husband. I'm filing for divorce," Linda said bluntly. "I've discovered he lied to me about having children and has been systematically depleting my inheritance. I wanted you to know that I completely support your position regarding Emma's estate." "Thank you. That means more than you know." Linda's voice hardened. "Mrs. Sullivan, Rob Sullivan is a predator. He targets women with resources and bleeds them dry. I've been documenting his financial abuse for months, and I'm prepared to testify about his character if necessary." That afternoon, Rob appeared at my door without calling. He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled clothes, the polish completely gone from his appearance. "Maggie, please. The media attention is destroying what's left of my life. Linda's filed for divorce. Her lawyers have frozen our joint accounts. I'm going to lose everything." "You lost everything that mattered 15 years ago," I said. "You just didn't realize it at the time. I made mistakes, but Emma was still my daughter. I deserve something from her success." "Rob, you legally terminated your parental rights. You chose $300 a month over having a daughter. That decision has consequences." His desperation was palpable. "There has to be something we can work out, some way to settle this quietly. The only settlement available is the one Emma already provided," I said. "She left detailed instructions about what should happen if you tried to claim her inheritance." I handed him a sealed envelope Victoria had prepared. Inside was Emma's final message to her father, written in her own hand during her last weeks. "To Robert Sullivan, you terminated your legal rights to me when I was 11 years old to avoid paying child support. You chose money over your own daughter then, and you're choosing money over her memory now. I have legally ensured you will receive exactly what you chose to give me over the past 15 years. Nothing." Rob read the letter twice, his hands shaking. "She really knew about the termination?" "She knew everything, Rob. About Carol Jenkins and her daughter, about your financial abuse of Linda, about every family you've destroyed, chasing easy money." That's when Rob finally understood he hadn't just lost an inheritance claim. Emma's documentation of his pattern would follow him for the rest of his life, but the story wasn't over. Emma had one final surprise that would ensure Rob could never do this to another family again. The call came from Carol Jenkins the next morning. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been contacted by several other women who had relationships with Rob Sullivan over the years." "Other women?" "It appears your ex-husband has a more extensive pattern than any of us realized." Emma's private investigator found at least 4 women Rob targeted for their financial resources before abandoning them and their children. Victoria arrived an hour later with a folder of additional documentation. Emma's investigation had uncovered a trail of broken families stretching back to shortly after Rob left us. "Your daughter was very thorough. She didn't just document Rob's abandonment of Emma and Sarah Jenkins, she found a pattern of financial predation. The women had remarkably similar stories. Rob would charm his way into relationships with single mothers or women with inherited wealth. He'd play devoted partner and stepfather while systematically accessing and depleting their resources. When the money ran out, he'd disappear, often leaving behind confused children who'd bonded with him. Emma reached out to some of these women before she died, Victoria explained. She helped them understand they weren't alone and provided resources for counseling and legal support. That afternoon, David Washington called with news about Rob's latest legal maneuver. He's hired a new attorney who's trying to argue that his parental rights termination was coerced. They're claiming he was pressured into signing documents he didn't understand. Can they make that argument stick? Not with the evidence Emma compiled. The termination was voluntary, witnessed, and Rob had legal representation. But more importantly, Emma anticipated this exact argument. Emma had recorded a video deposition during her final month, specifically addressing the possibility that Rob might claim his rights termination was invalid. In clear, lucid testimony, She detailed how she'd discovered the termination documents and her father's pattern of abandoning children. Emma also arranged for Carol Jenkins and the other women to provide sworn statements about Rob's character and pattern of behavior, David continued. If Rob wants to challenge his terminated rights, all of this evidence becomes admissible. But Emma's masterstroke was yet to be revealed. She'd established not just a defense against Rob's claims, but a counteroffensive that would ensure he faced consequences for his lifetime of abandoning children. Emma set up a victims' advocacy fund, Victoria explained. If Rob pursued inheritance claims beyond the initial demand, the fund would finance a class action lawsuit against him on behalf of all the children he'd abandoned. The fund had enough money to pursue Rob legally for years. Every child he'd bonded with and then abandoned could seek damages for emotional distress and the psychological impact of his desertion. Your daughter essentially created a legal trap, David said admiringly. The more aggressively Rob pursued her inheritance, the more devastating the consequences would become for him personally. That evening, Rob's new attorney called requesting a settlement conference. The desperation in his voice suggested they'd finally grasped the full scope of what Emma had prepared for them. But Emma had one final revelation that would end Rob's inheritance claims permanently and expose the true depths of his character to everyone who'd ever trusted him. The settlement conference took place in David Washington's office. Rob arrived with his new attorney, a younger man named Kevin Barnes who looked like he'd bitten off more than he could chew. My client is prepared to significantly reduce his inheritance claim in exchange for avoiding further public scrutiny, Barnes began carefully. Your client has no inheritance claim, David responded. His parental rights were legally terminated. This meeting is purely a courtesy. Rob looked haggard, wearing the same clothes from 3 days earlier. The media attention and Linda's divorce filing had clearly taken their toll. Maggie, please, I know I made mistakes, but there has to be something, some acknowledgement that I was Emma's father. You were her biological father, I said quietly, but you chose not to be her parent when she needed one. Barnes tried a different approach. Even if the parental rights termination stands, there might be grounds for a moral claim. Mr. Sullivan contributed genetically to Emma's intelligence and abilities. Victoria, who'd been silent until now, laughed out loud. Are you seriously arguing that Rob Sullivan deserves money because Emma inherited intelligence? From the man who abandoned her to avoid $300 a month? That's when David opened Emma's final file. Actually, there's something else we need to discuss. Emma's investigation uncovered information about Mr. Sullivan that goes beyond abandoning children for financial reasons. The room fell silent as David placed a stack of documents on the table. Emma discovered that Mr. Sullivan has been using false identities and social security numbers to avoid debt collectors and hide assets from ex-wives. Rob went pale. That's not... I never... The documentation is comprehensive, David continued. Credit applications under false names, bank accounts opened with stolen identities, tax evasion spanning multiple states. Emma's investigators found evidence of identity theft and fraud going back 12 years. Barnes looked like he wanted to disappear. This is the first I'm hearing of this. Emma anticipated that revealing Rob's criminal activity might be necessary to protect her mother from harassment, Victoria explained. She wanted to ensure that if Rob continued pursuing inheritance claims, law enforcement would become involved. The identity fraud evidence was devastating. Rob had been creating false personas to obtain credit and avoid legal obligations to his abandoned families. The Social Security fraud alone carried federal penalties that could result in years of prison time. Emma left instructions that if her father escalated his inheritance claims beyond initial contact, this evidence should be forwarded to federal prosecutors, David said. She wanted to ensure he couldn't continue victimizing women and children. Rob was shaking now. Please, Maggie, don't let them do this. I'll drop all claims, I'll disappear. Just don't turn over those files. I looked at this pathetic man who'd once been my husband, the father of my brilliant daughter. Rob, you should have thought about consequences before you chose to prey on vulnerable families for 15 years. Barnes was hastily packing his briefcase. Mr. Sullivan, I need to advise you that I can't continue representation given these allegations. That's when Emma's final message was revealed. A video she'd recorded days before her death, specifically intended for this moment. Emma's pale but determined face appeared on David's laptop screen. "Dad, if you're watching this, it means you tried to claim money from the daughter you abandoned. I've documented every family you've destroyed, every child you've left wondering why they weren't worth staying for. The legal evidence I've compiled will ensure you face consequences for your choices. But more than that, I want you to know that despite everything you did to us, Mom and I built a beautiful life. We were happy, we succeeded, and we did it all without you." The video continued. "I'm leaving my fortune to help children abandoned by parents like you. Mom will oversee scholarships and support programs for kids who need to know they're valuable, even when their fathers walk away. That's your legacy, Dad. Not inheritance money, but proof that children can thrive without parents who choose not to love them." Rob was crying now, the weight of Emma's words and the consequences of his choices finally hitting him. But it was too late for tears. Emma had ensured that justice would follow him for whatever time he had left. 3 weeks later, Rob Sullivan stood in federal court facing charges of identity fraud, tax evasion, and Social Security fraud. Emma's documentation had been thorough enough to interest prosecutors in 3 states where Rob had created false identities to obtain credit and avoid obligations to his abandoned families. I watched from the gallery as the man who'd once promised to love and protect our family was led away in handcuffs. Linda Morrison sat beside me, having provided additional evidence of Rob's financial crimes during their marriage. "Emma would have been satisfied with this outcome," Linda said quietly. "Justice for all the children he abandoned." The judge sentenced Rob to 4 years in federal prison, followed by restitution payments to his victims. He would never be financially secure again, spending whatever remained of his life paying for the families he'd destroyed. But Emma's real victory wasn't Rob's punishment. It was the scholarship fund she'd established, the counseling programs she'd endowed, and the network of support she'd created for abandoned children. Carol Jenkins brought her daughter Sarah to Emma's memorial service a month later. Sarah, now 17 and bound for college with Emma's scholarship support, spoke about how knowing Emma had helped her heal from her abandonment. "Emma showed me that being abandoned by a father doesn't mean you're not worth loving," Sarah said. "She proved that children like us can build something beautiful from the broken pieces." Victoria and I continued Emma's work, expanding the foundation to help more families affected by parental abandonment. Emma's business success had given us resources, but her compassion had shown us how to use them. 6 months after Rob's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. He apologized for abandoning Emma and asked for forgiveness. I read it once and then filed it away with Emma's investigation documents. Some apologies come too late to matter. The final revelation came a year later when Victoria and I discovered Emma's last secret project. She'd been working with legislators to strengthen laws protecting children from financial abandonment by parents. Her draft legislation, now known as the Emma Sullivan Child Protection Act, made it much harder for parents to legally abandon children to avoid financial responsibilities. "She knew she was dying," Victoria told me as we reviewed Emma's legislative research. "But she wanted to make sure her death protected other children from what she experienced." The bill passed unanimously. Emma's name would be associated not just with technological innovation, but with legal protections for vulnerable children. I still live in the same house where Emma grew up, surrounded by photos of the brilliant, compassionate woman she became despite her father's abandonment. The $35 million Emma left behind funds scholarships, counseling programs, and legal advocacy for abandoned children. But Emma's greatest gift wasn't the money. It was the proof that love, determination, and refusal to be defeated by abandonment can create something beautiful from the worst betrayal. Rob Sullivan thought he could walk back into our lives and claim what Emma had built. Instead, he discovered that the 8-year-old girl he'd abandoned had grown into a woman who could destroy him with documentation, precision, and the kind of justice he'd spent 15 years avoiding. That's who Emma Sullivan was. My daughter, who turned abandonment into armor and used her brilliant mind to protect every child who came after her. Rob Sullivan gave her life, but he never gave her love. And in the end, that made all the difference in the world. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.